Michael Palmer. Uh, I'm Michael Martoccio, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So, where I want to begin today is with a curious debate that occurred in May 1329. Let's make sure that I get that. There we go. According to the Florentine merchant chronicler Giovanni Villani, one day a group of Augustinian friars from Lucca arrived in Florence, asked for an audience before an assembly of Florence's citizens, and made them an offer difficult to refuse. The clerics had been sent to mediate on behalf of Marco Visconti, the captain of the mercenary Compagnia del Cernuglio. A few weeks earlier, Visconti had been approached by the Archbishop of Florence, Francesco Silvestri, and a Florentine knight, Pino della Tossa, who, quote, making great promises of money from the Florentine commune, had implied Visconti should attack the neighboring commune of Lucca, overthrow its rulers, and then sell the city of Lucca to the Florentines for 80,000 gold florins. Despite della Tossa being, in Villani's words, quote, a sufficient and valorous knight, he and Silvestri had hatched this scheme without the Florentine government's permission. Thus, when Visconti had indeed captured Lucca and sent the aforementioned Augustinian friars to finalize and collect the money, there had been a good deal of surprise, as you can imagine, and a rushed meeting of citizens called. Florence's rulers faced a difficult choice. Should they pay the mercenary and take the city, or punish della Tossa and Silvestri for so obviously dragging them into this debacle? Quoting Villani again, quote, about this time there were held many meetings in Florence, during which a number of politicians spoke out against the offer. Principal among them, Simone della Tossa, a close kin of Pino della Tossa, who, quote, showing with beautiful and colorful language the secrecy of Messer Marco and the Germans, who had been our adversaries and enemies, Simone goes on to issue a stern rejection of this offer, fulminating about how buying Lucca, quote, would not bring honor to the commune of Florence, because the Florentines should not buy other men. This would be a disgrace for the commune, a city of commerce, to take the war booty of the Germans, that is, the city of Lucca. Was buying a city honorable? And if so, at what price? This is one of the fundamental questions motivating my monograph, Leviathan for Sale. This book is a study of Renaissance Italian territorial expansion by means of money, and of how people across a broad range of Renaissance society talked about and imagined empire as monetizable. At its core, Leviathan for Sale follows how, in an intensely short period of time, 1350 to 1450, the peninsula's republics and lordships bought and sold scores of cities, villages, and smaller settlements, fundamentally reshaping Italian political geography from a patchwork of dozens of urban and rural comuni into a handful of regional powers, the republics of Florence and Venice, the Duchy of Milan, and the Papal States. Now, examples of this buying and selling abound. The Florentines, for example, bought Pisa, Prato, Sarzana, Cortona, Livorno, Lucca, and Arezzo, reveling in their purchase of the latter with, as none other than Machiavelli opined a century and a half later, quote, as joyous a celebration as any other city might have done for a proper victory. The Sienese bought from nearby lords the castles of Montegiove, Monteverdi, Montalcino, Monteano, Montemaso, and dozens more, not on a hillside or a mountaintop, before indebted, ceding their own city, Siena, to Gian Galeazzo Visconti in the late 1390s on the condition that he, as the Treaty of Submission clarified, quote, neither sell nor in any other way transfer them, the Sienese. The Venetians spent thousands of ducati buying their maritime empire in Dalmatia and the Aegean, including Crete, Tenedos, Raspo, Lepanto, Patras, Argos, Corfu, and Zadar, obtaining the final city at a cost Antonio Morosini bemoaned was, quote, more than one would receive from the selling of the whole of Slavonia. The Milanese paid 200,000 florins to the ruler of Bologna, Giovanni Pepoli, to sell his city in 1350, only for Pepoli to be met with shouts of, quote, don't sell us, from his subjects. And after the Florentines turned down that offer I just mentioned from the Augustinian friars in 1329, Lucca was sold 7 times over the course of the next 12 years. A disgrace the chronicler Giovanni Sercambi likened to being, quote, a prostitute in a brothel. So if this map is the picture that our minds most often conjure when conceptualizing the political development of Italy in the Renaissance, then this map is its photo negative. The peninsula's great powers are absent here. Rather, the areas that I've grayed out are the cities, islands, and regions that Italy's rulers bought from 1350. All told, approximately 30 to 40% of the modern landmass of the Italian peninsula, alongside substantial parts of the Aegean, were traded, bought, mortgaged, pawned, or, as importantly, put up on offer but never actually exchanged in these years. A market in city-states that ultimately totaled many millions of florins and ducats. Once we realize that for a substantial number of Renaissance Italians, their experience of the empire looked something like a commercial exchange, suddenly all manner of other questions arise. How did they price political communities? How did political elite come to think of their communities as quantifiable, monetizable, and ultimately vendable, sellable? And finally, how did rulers integrate the purchase of subject cities into imperial myths and legitimizing discourses of empire? And as importantly, how did subjects resist or assimilate the purchases of their communities into their own memories and acts of resistance? So these are the questions I try to answer in the book, which is organized like any Renaissance commercial transaction, beginning with how Renaissance rulers priced cities and paid for these imperial projects, before turning attention toward the other side of that transaction, toward the sellers of cities and the subject communities acquired. Now to foreground a little bit, my argument in the book is that Renaissance Italian rulers, many of whom were themselves merchants, developed over time a commercialized ideology of empire that reaffirmed their own mercantile self-worth. Now, it's important, I don't want to deny the violence that often underwrote these exchanges. Recall that Simone della Tossa's resistance to buying Lucca was that it was, quote, the war booty of Marco Visconti's mercenary company. Yet, nevertheless, contemporaries came to believe that buying a city was a morally appropriate form of territorial acquisition, along with forms of voluntary submission, which Monique and a number of other scholars have worked on. Purchasing a city formed part of the stabilizing discourse of Renaissance empire. I call this phenomenon the market for city-states not then to invoke a modern capitalist equilibrium of supply and demand, but to suggest that a range of Renaissance actors, including jurists, diplomats, artists, preachers, poets, and subjects, made legible territorial conquest through norms of acceptable conduct drawn from Renaissance commercial practices, quite literally drawn from the market, from the mercato. Now, I should say I'm still completing final revisions of the book over this academic year, so I'm very much looking forward to your feedback and comments. But what I'd like to do with my time left today is narrow in a little closer on debates like the one between Pino and Simone della Tossa in 1329, and consider in a little bit more depth the price of cities in Renaissance Italy. Now, buying a city was a bargaining process, with offers going back and forth between the buyer and the seller. And in those cases, when the buyer was a merchant republic, we are lucky enough to have extracts of the meeting discussions of civic consultative bodies, or at least the summary of those decisions. A particularly revealing example of one of these debates over civic price occurred in 1408, 1409, when a special 30-man committee was formed from members of the Venetian Senate to hear offers for the sale of Dalmatia. The Venetians long had designs on the region, having ruled Dalmatia's capital, Zara in Italian, or Zadar in Croatian, periodically since the 12th century, before being expelled in 1358 by Louis of Hungary, only for Louis's quarreling inheritors, King Ladislas of Naples and Sigismund of Luxembourg, to run short of money and put the region up for offer to Venice. Tasked to work in secret, the Venetian commissioners first had to determine who to negotiate with, because quote, as they said, we did not know to which of these two kingdoms the government and rule of Dalmatia belonged, and then determine what exactly they were buying. Not just Zara, but also, as this commission laid out, quote, Lorana, the castle of Novigradi, the island of Pago, all of Dalmatia and its lands, castles, forts, islands, villas, and territory. As negotiations went back and forth and dragged on, the committee increasingly turned its attention to Ladislas, to those lands, quote, in Dalmatia he wants to sell, that is to say, which ones he can sell. And over the next few months, aggressively bargained the monarch's envoys down, the price falling from 300,000 ducats in December 1408 to 200,000 about a month later, to 150,000 a few days after that, to as low as 70,000 before settling in early July of 1409 on a final asking price of 100,000 ducats. Throughout, the committee offered many justifications for slashing Dalmatia's price. Costlier offers were, quote, too great an effort, expense, scandal, and error. And regardless, quote, 100,000 ducats is considered a great amount of money. The commissioners made clear that they, quote, would not stoop to a greater price than 100,000 ducats for all the lands and places of Dalmatia. Because, end quote, because following a major rebellion of Dalmatian towns in mid-1409, quote, this land of Dalmatia is at war and deserted. Quote, they have the smallest harbors, indeed as if they had nothing in their ports. And if we took them under our dominion, there is no doubt that for their custody and defense alone, we would have to accept by ourselves acquiring enemies and not friends, which would require us to continue paying a great expense, the committee members worried. And so with the Venetians unwilling to raise the price anymore, envoys of Ladislas agreed on 9 July 1409 to, as Antonio Morosini remembered, quote, transfer and give the rule of Dalmatia which belonged to him completely, and to transfer the city of Zara with all the islands which the king had possessed for a long time for a price of 100,000 ducats of gold, end quote. I think it's worth pausing to consider the many ways these Venetian patricians estimated the price of Dalmatia. The region's price reflected its past, the legitimacy of Ladislas or Sigismund's title to the region, which, as the committee admitted, they, quote, did not know. It reflected the region's present state, the quality of Dalmatia's lands, which were, quote, at war and deserted, and its ports, which were small. And the region's price reflected its future, the need for the Venetians to defend Dalmatia at some point against, quote, enemies and not friends, which would require us to continue paying a great expense. Now, while we can't open the closed door of the Senate council chamber to know more about what the Venetian commissioners thought about the price of Dalmatia, we can do that for a near identical debate just 4 years earlier during an emergency pratica in Florence called on 14 August 1405. Surviving records show that the meeting was attended by the city's most important men, including Maso dagli Albizzi, Rinaldo Gianfigliazzi, Buonaccorso Pitti, and Nicola d'Alzano. The attendance of so many grandees makes sense when we realize what was up for debate that day. An offer to buy the city and contado of Pisa for 250,000 gold florins. Like the Venetian claims on Dalmatia, Pisa had been up for sale on multiple occasions in the past decade and a half. Ever since the assassination of Pisa's lord and Florence's ally, Pietro Cambacorta, in 1392, Florentines had their eyes on purchasing Pisa. They first offered to buy it from the son of Gambacorta's assassin and new lord, Gerardo d'Appiano, for 500,000 gold florins, an offer d'Appiano rejected in favor of selling the city instead in 1399 to Florence's arch-rival, Gian Galeazzo Visconti. When Visconti in turn promptly died 3 years later, leaving Pisa to his bastard son, Gabriele Maria, and mistress Agnese Mandagazze, the Florentines swooped in again, making offers to buy Pisa from between 100,000 to 200,000 florins to Caterina Visconti, Gian Galeazzo's widow, as well as the Visconti commanders Marco Malatesta and Giovanni Colonna. Acts which spooked Gabriele Maria and Agnese to such a degree that they in turn gave their lordship as fief to the French king Charles VI and his representative, the governor of Genoa, John Mangea, known by his nom de guerre, Bosseco. So, the proposal then up for debate that hot August day raised multiple, complex, confusing, and overlapping questions. Who precisely had the right to sell Pisa? Gabriele Maria, Charles VI, Bosseco? What precisely was on offer? Pisa, its countryside, its citadel, Livorno, which at the time was under Bosseco's rule, or all of them, or none of them? And how much should whatever the Florentines buy actually cost? 100,000 florins, 200,000 florins, 250,000 florins, 500,000 florins? Here are the records of that meeting. And what I want to do is read for you key points of the discussants debated. So what you're about to hear, these are the words that were copied down by the notary for that debate over the price of Pisa. For 250,000 florins, we should have Livorno too. In no way should Pisa's business be meddled with. If Livorno and the citadel are given, then the enterprise should be done, or else not. We should proceed as quickly as possible and seize Pisa and its capital, and its citadel. We should pursue this and do whatever we can to have the city of Pisa. This business should be carried out to its end. And finally, the requested price, or the price, should be diminished for the greater utility of the commune. Now, these are snippets, of course, of what were surely longer speeches, and we should be careful not to overinterpret them. But nevertheless, consider again what has just happened here. These are the voices of a handful of incredibly wealthy Florentine merchants debating the acquisition of their biggest rival. And what's the largest source of contention? For that amount of money, we should have Livorno too. As these debates over civic price in Venice and Florence suggest, by the early 15th century, Italians had developed a quantifiable, monetizable, and vendable sense of their political communities. This process had its origins in the Italian merchant elite's quest for communal autonomy over the previous 2 centuries from their feudal overlords, the emperor and papacy. Poets and propagandists had celebrated Italian civic life in praise poems, laudes civitatem, that quantified and monetized the wealth and production of these communi. Communal diplomats had aggressively negotiated with emperors to secure their rights of vicariate, simultaneously acquiring newfound autonomy while literally pricing their cities. And numerous images imagine miniaturized versions of these cities passing from patron saint to divine intercessor, confirming the idea of these communities as inherently transactional. To discussants in Venice and Florence, then, a range of factors had shaped civic price, including the economic profitability of the territory, the legitimacy of the claim, and the political utility of the project But they all agreed about one thing. They could buy and sell a neighboring city. Sorry, let me go back one. There we go. Similar themes emerge if we look at the diplomatic negotiations or diplomatic instructions given to ambassadors negotiating purchase pacts, which, like any commercial contract, enumerated the price of the city on offer as well as the terms of payment, usually a lump sum at handover and further amounts in the coming weeks or years. Here again, I want to stress that rather than coldly calculating, ambassadors worked with a multiplicity of overlapping and at times competing ideas about where the price of cities came from. Without a doubt, ambassadors negotiating civic price had some basic rules they followed. The first being to work with a tempo and not let a good offer slip away. Quote, do it fast, offering the money provided for it, stressed Bernardo Guadagni during a 1404 practice discussing the purchase of Sarzana from Giovanni Colonna. Quote, immediately get him to answer yes or no, and then come back to us, the Florentine Dieci subsequently instructed their ambassador to Colonna, adding how they wanted Colonna to sign the treaty selling Sarzana as soon as possible in order to, quote, not give him any more hope of more money. Reading ambassadors' instructions, one can even sense competition, real or imagined, in this market for city-states, and negotiators were often told to show caution when propositioning the sale of a city. For example, when in early November 1384, the Venetian Senate sent their ambassador Giovanni Condomer to the court of Charles of Durazzo to look into potentially buying the Durazzo-controlled island of Corfu, they instructed Condomer to move, quote, with discretion and prudence, because, as the instructions explained, the Genoese had sent their own representative, Gaspare Spinola, to also inquire on the island. Quote, see if Spinola or any other Genoese have already obtained on behalf of Genoa the island of Corfu, the instructions read, telling Condomer to be careful, quote, to not raise the question if the Genoese are having difficulty. Going on, the instructions presented Condomer with two options. If, on the one hand, the ambassador learned of no ongoing negotiations between the Genoese and Charles, the Senate permitted him to, quote, deal with the acquisition of Corfu by sale or pledge without exceeding the figure of 60,000 ducats. Yet, quote, if an agreement is in the process of being made between Spinola and any other Genoese and King Charles, end quote, Condomer was to undercut the Genoese offer, the Senate giving him permission to, quote, promise up to 70,000 or 80,000, and even to go as high as 100,000 ducats in order to, quote, succeed in this deal. Condomer's instructions suggest, I think at first glance, perhaps a close relationship between competition and price, one shaped by the not yet visible hand of supply and demand. But the scholar who goes looking for a dehumanized, rational market in the Renaissance cities trade will not find it. Rather than capitalist, contemporaries fit civic prices into their own contemporary understandings of consumer culture. Returning again to the discussants in the Florentine Consulte Pratiche, it is arresting how often they weighed civic price on the twin scales of utility, utilitas, and honor, honorum. For example, discussants raised concerns about balancing the two ideas during a practica in 10 October 1404 in the context of a scheme hatched by Marchesa Malaspina di Fondenovo to broker an exchange between Florence and the mercenary captain Giovanni Colonna for the castle of Sarzana. Opponents of the sale stressed how the offer should be, quote, dismissed sight unseen, because the project would, quote, cause more harm than good, utilitas, by displeasing Florence's neighbors. This was countered by people who wished to proceed with the deal. Quote, the signori, collegi, and dieci should follow through with this business, as it will appear useful and honorable for the comune. The Press of Livorno, on offer in May 1421, from the Doge of Genoa, Tommaso di Campo Fregoso, presented a similar balancing act. Quote, we must consider two things. whether to accept Livorno if we can obtain it from the Doge and the Genoese, and second, whether the cost is worth the acquisition. Terms of Pisa's prosperity and security warned Nicola da Ozzano. Throughout these negotiations, honor and utility were, as Giovanni Guicciardini and Rinaldo degli Albizzi remarked in one session from January 1421, quote, the two things for which we strive most in this world. As members of Italy's commercial elite, da Ozzano, Guicciardini, and Albizzi knew well the complex and delicate relationship between honor and utility in early Renaissance Italian commercial culture. Advice in the maintenance of onore e utile filled Renaissance merchant manuals and family ricordanze, and the two poles operated as part of what Riccardo Gallino Court called, quote, a virtuous cycle that established and reiterated complex commercial expectations of courtesy, service, and obligation among members of the international merchant community. Prices in Renaissance Italy, whether they be for a city or for a cord of silk, went beyond just the instrumental, the money spent. Rather, prices were intimately connected to a larger honorific and reputational economy, goods acquiring what Daniel Lord Smale has called the, quote, two-part nature of value in late medieval consumer culture, the one financial, the other charismatic. The same can be said for civic price. As with commercial objects, civic prices became swept up into vast communicative systems of prestige and imperializing legitimacy among competing Italian elites. Stories about the prices of cities grew with ease and entered into wider circulation through public forms of political communication, a process we can communicate, or we can appreciate more fully when we swing open the closed doors of city council meetings, roll up the flaps of diplomats' tents, and look out at how civic prices actually circulated around the broader cultural landscape. The price a ruler paid for a city formed first and foremost part of that ruler's legitimating discourse with their new subjects. Prices crafted what Monique has called, in the context of voluntary dedicative orations, the, quote, stabilizing framework of the expanding state. For example, after the Florentines purchased Arezzo in 1384 from the Picard mercenary Captain Engoran de Coisset, one of the first acts was to send the politician and merchant Rinaldo Gianfiliazzi to deliver a message of reconciliation to an Argentine Parlamento held in Arezzo's Palazzo dei Priori. Quote, the Lord of Coisset treated with the Comune of Florence to sell, give, and concede the city of Arezzo and its holdings for a certain amount of money. And the Comune of Florence, knowing this to be the more secure and safer route than war, and that also from the way of war the great ruin and destruction of the city of Arezzo had followed, we weighed the matter and executed by means of money. And thus, for the sake of the Comune of Arezzo, we received it for the greatest amount of money, all calculated, spending more than 200,000 florins. Truly, the most anyone could pay out. To hear Gianfiliazzi describe it, Florence's claims to legitimacy in Arezzo rested not on the threat of violence, nor on the voluntary submission of the Argentine people, but in Florence's willingness to pay, quote, truly the most anyone could pay out to preserve the city and the people of Arezzo. Gianfiliazzi's words were in fact quite common. Following the purchase of a city, one of the first actions rulers often took was to announce loudly the price they paid for it. Returning to the Florentine purchase of Pisa in 1405, one of the first acts of the Florentine government when they finally bought their neighbor, it ended up being at 205,000 gold florins, and without Livorno. One of their first acts after buying the city was to blitz the region with the celebratory news. Quote, make a note to His Holiness about the acquisition of the rights of the title of Pisa and its contado lands and castle by us for 205,000 florins. The Florentines instructed their ambassador to the Roman Pope Innocent VII. They sent similar letters to the Sienese, Genoese, and Neapolitans, while accurate valuations of the exchange and chronicles from Lucca and Venice suggest that Florence's message reached an even wider audience. Narrative histories and chronicles from the period swelled with civic prices. Yet despite the hard work civic propagandists and diplomats invested in publicizing these monetary exchanges, the prices of cities provoked particular problems of valuation and enumeration. and thus moral valuation for narrative historians. The price of Treviso, for example, sold in the 1380s to Francesco il Vecchio Carrara, ruler of Padua, varied wildly from chronicle to chronicle. Depending on who you read, the Veneto town sold for either 60,000 gold ducats, 80,000 ducats, 100,000 ducats, 118,000 ducats, or as the Venetian Giorgio Dolfin noted, for an unenumerated quantity, an amount only noteworthy in that it went, quote, against the honor of Venice. Other cities were even harder for chroniclers to accurately price. Despite Rinaldo Gianfiliazzi's speech I mentioned a few minutes ago to the Argentine Parlamento claiming the Florentines had paid 200,000 florins for the city of Arezzo, chroniclers differed enthusiastically on the price the Florentines paid for Arezzo in 1384, listing the cost at, depending on the chronicle, 30,000 florins, 36,000 florins, 40,000 florins, 50,000 florins, 56,000 florins, 57,000 florins, 60, 63, or 70,000 gold florins, while also disputing who precisely sold the Florentines the city: the mercenary Cossé, his lord Louis of Anjou, Louis's rival Charles of Puglia, Charles's deputy Jacopo Caracciolo, or as the very ill-informed 17th century English travel writer and courtier Robert Dallington wrote, Mestino della Scala, lord of Verona, who by that point had been dead 3 decades. Now, I want to argue that such confusion over civic prices was not because these chroniclers struggled with accuracy or numeracy. Rather, the fact that 9 different chroniclers arrived at 9 different prices for Arezzo meant that these chroniclers told 9 different stories about the sale of this town. Some positive, some negative, but all embedded within contemporary commercial notions of the relationship among honor, value, and price. And manifest in these forms of collective historical memory, the prices of cities possess not simply quantitative importance, but multiple cultural meanings. Nowhere can we better see how the historical memory of civic prices differed across time and place than if we go back to where I started the talk, to Marco Visconti's failed sale of Lucca to the Florentines for 80,000 florins in 1329. Rather than mark the end of Florentine efforts to acquire Lucca by means of money, the 1329 bid instead initiated a torturous few decades for the Lucchese and Florentines, during which the former passed quickly among a who's who of rulers, while the latter tried and failed time again to buy their smaller neighbor, the Florentines only succeeding in buying Lucca from the then ruler of Lucca, the aforementioned Veronese lord Mestino della Scala, in 1341 for 250,000 florins, 12 years after the first offer and over triple the original asking price. But even this arrangement did not settle the affairs of Lucca. Within a month after the Florentines bought it, the Pisans, terrified at the prospect of Florentine encirclement, besieged the town and soon after crushed a Florentine relief force, ending Florence's bid for the city, but vitally not clearing Florence's debts for Lucca. Financial records show the Florentines ultimately paid out to the Della Scala nearly 140,000 florins for a city they bought but never ruled. And if you want to know more about that, I can tell you about that in the Q&A about why that actually happens. More importantly, for contemporary historical writers, such a debacle demanded an explanation, and no one wrote more vigorously at the time about it than Giovanni Villani. Villani had been a bullish supporter of buying Lucca at 80,000 florins in 1329. Quote, "It seems to me that nothing would be a greater vendetta, nor would greater praise and glorious fame be sent out into the world if one was able to say, the merchants and the citizens of Florence with their money have bought Lucca and its citizens and country folk for 80,000 gold florins." Villani remembered, adding how the purchase at that price befit Florence, a city, quote, "of great, generous, and esteemed merchants, better at commerce than war," Yet according to Villani, at 250,000 florins, the city was not merely overpriced, but a mark of a far deeper rot within Florentine society. The chronicler laying blame for the high price on the private greed of his neighbors. Quote, each of them, through various devices and ways, served his own interests or that of his friends, Villani belittled. But more than the factional, Villani's complaints centered on the commercial. His fiercest rage spewed at the poor commercial acumen of his fellow Florentine merchants. Villani tell it, Florence's commerce was on the ebb in 1341. The chronicler recounting how private greed and a rash of runs on Florentine banks had, quote, lowered the commerce of the mercatantia and crafts of the whole comune. Rather than raise the collective commercial reputation of Florence and Florentines as a deal at 80,000 gold florins would have, the 250,000 florin deal that the commune ended up negotiating with Mastino della Scala had the opposite effect, dimming the city's commercial acumen and reputation. The Scaglieri brothers Mastino and Alberto, quote, would have left the negotiations to sell Lucca if not for the private reasons, false hypocritical excuses, and barratry, end quote, of Florence's rulers who kept the price high. To Villani, then, Lucca's price was a monetary index of the political health of Florence's commune. At 80,000 florins, Lucca's price revealed a healthy community of, quote, great, generous, and esteemed merchants. At 250,000 florins, though, the price of Lucca revealed something much more sinister. Private gains and barratry. 30 years later, the Florentine oral poet, bell ringer, and town crier Antonio Pucci put Villani's ridicule into even starker terms in a parody poem, Nuovo Lamento di Pieta Rimato. Performed on a rostrum in Florence's Mercato Vecchio, Pucci took on the voice of an anthropomorphized Florence, lamenting his, i.e. Florence's, disastrous Lucchese purchase. E guareggiando comuni e tirani, più e più volte ho raddoppiato I danni. Nel 41 credendo uscire da Fani, ove d'amore. Diedi a Messer Mestin del mio tesoro 180 miglia di farin d'oro per aver lucco col suo tentitoro in mio belia. Questo mi fu peggior mercanzia che I comperassi mai in vita mia. The worst commercial deal I ever made in my life. It's quite a statement, and one we have to appreciate at some level, express not the opinions of Pucci necessarily as the poet, but his audience, Florentine merchants and artisans in the city's main market. All of whom were keenly aware of the importance of not only keeping prices low, but maintaining honor and utility in their dealings. Indeed, in another poem on the Lucchese enterprise, Pucci dramatically softened his tone, celebrating rather than lamenting the purchase. A reminder again of the fluid meaning of civic prices. Pucci's performance of this poem, O Lucchesi Pregiati, in 1369 for Lucca's ruling council, the Anziani, was to celebrate the freedom of Lucca from the Pisans, who had ruled it since 1341. An event that this poem is captured here in this watercolor illustration. In the poem, Pucci asked the Lucchesi to reflect on the many times their city had been bought and sold in the recent past. The poet claiming that all these rulers never thought of Lucca as a polity to govern, but as a sort of investment to exploit. Yet, unlike the previous rulers, Pucci made the claim that the Florentines never intended to rule the Lucchesi, but to save them and free them. Ricordivi, fratelli, ogni stagione, dei Fiorentini che sono per voi deserti. Non si potrebbe con piena ragione dir quanti mali hanno già per voi sofferti. Now, whether the Lucchesi present in 1369 believed Pucci's orational presentation or not is unclear. But the poem certainly circulated in Lucca. This illustration of the poem, it's from Giovanni Sercambi's Le Cronaca di Lucca, a 2-volume city chronicle written around 1400. which included a copy of Pucci's poem and a long description of the buying and selling of Lucca in the 1320s, 30s, and early 40s. As one of the central traumas of his narrative, the purchase of Lucca animated much discussion in Sercampi, as well as a series of illustrations of the exchange, such as this one, that shows the purchase of Lucca quite literally as a commercial transaction. If we look on the left side, there's representatives of the seller, the scalieri, under their banner, the ladder, to the left, and those of the Florentines under the lily to the right, exchanging money and signing what appears to be an accounting ledger. Now, Sercampi's depiction of the purchase of Lucca in 1341 is long, and I'm short on time. But what I want to leave you with is what Sercampi said about the purchase of Lucca in 1341. Quote, "And although the Florentines named a price of 250,000 florins, what I say about this is that the paid sum was actually less, despite the listed price being so great. And such a list price was made for no other purpose than to show each person black from white. It was known that the said Messer Mastino had not been paid for Lucca over 40,000 florins." Now, why the price of Lucca in 1341 had, 2 generations later, become such a matter of uncertainty and contention for Sercampi speaks to just how malleable civic prices could become once these florins and ducats leapt off bills of sale, journeyed around the region's rumor mill, and entered into historical memory. As I've argued today, a close examination of the buying and selling of cities, castles, and regions from 1350 to 1450, what I colloquially call the market for city-states, does more than just provide a new approach to the study of the rise of the Renaissance state. It offers, I think, a more expansive opportunity to contemplate the relationship between money, price, value, honor, and utility in Renaissance Italian society. Putting this distinctly commercial vocabulary back into the history of Renaissance Italian imperialism offers a fruitful addition to long-standing debates on the moral and legal roots of Renaissance territorial empire. Scholars have long known that Renaissance rulers sought to present their imperial projects as legitimate, just, and orderly through a combination of Christian justice, legal opinion, and humanistic oration. Rather than supersede these discourses, commercial vocabularies, like the ones I've discussed today, offered Renaissance rulers still another discursive pathway to legitimating empire. Now, I think there are real stakes to this research beyond Renaissance Italy as well. For those of us who work in the United States, we should never forget that we live in a country Europeans and their settler colonial inheritors bought and sold. From Louisiana to Alaska, from Gadsden to the U.S. Virgin Islands, Americans bought their country and its territories from European rulers and native peoples, doing so, to borrow the words of Thomas Jefferson, quote, "with the price in one hand and the sword in the other." Now, a wealth of scholarship has examined how Europeans came to imagine the world as quantifiable, monetizable, and ultimately vendable, and how such an ideology of vendable sovereignty greatly shaped European imperialism from 1500 to 1900. Yet what these studies overlook is that Europeans well before 1500 had developed a vendable sense of their political communities. Grounded in the new contractual, notarial, and accounting practices of the commercial revolution, European rulers from Iberia to Germany to the Aegean priced, pawned, mortgaged, bought, and sold offices, titles, fiefs, cities, and entire territories in the 2 centuries before Europeans entered the Atlantic world. The practice may have been most acute amongst the wealthy cities of Italy, but it happened continent-wide. Leviathan for Sale is then not a book about the expansion of a handful of powerful Italian cities at the expense of weaker neighbors, nor just an exercise in accounting for many millions of too often overlooked florins and ducats, but a case study of how the act of acquiring empire by means of money forced Renaissance Italians to confront ideas that gripped early modern European political and economic culture more generally. The unstable relationship between value and price, the monetary rhetoric of empire, and the anxieties about the role of money in politics. Thank you very much.